Assalamu alaikum everyone. So my name is Mustafa Faruqi and I'm the chair of Muslim Aid, which is one of the charity or the only charity sponsored today. So you'll be hearing a bit more about Muslim Aid later, but for now, it's my honour to be the chair of this panel, which isn't a panel actually, it's just me asking Baroness Sayeeda some questions, and there'll be some opportunities for you to ask her questions at the end too. But Baroness Warsi, for anyone who doesn't know her, is a lawyer by training. She is also a member of the House of Lords. She is the first ever Muslim cabinet minister, the first Muslim woman candidate selected by the Conservative Party to be an MP, the first ever Muslim co-chair of the party, and certainly the first, and probably sadly the last, ever wear a shalwar commutes to Downing Street for work. And our most recent book is Muslims Don't Matter, referring to the multiple double standards that exist in public discourse when it comes to how politicians and the media deal with issues that relate to Muslims. Baroness Warsi, thank you so much for joining us here today. We first met at the British Muslim All-Party Parliamentary Group a couple of years ago, which was partly set up to create a definition of Islamophobia. And you also kindly invited me to your book launch last year. And in your book, you said that it wasn't quite the time to start buying diamonds and leaving the country in the way that a lot of Jewish women did when they fled Nazi Germany. With everything that's happened in the last couple of weeks, with the world's richest man now starting to target Muslims by using the grooming gangs issue, with people calling for Tommy Robinson to be freed, with Reform now leading the other parties in some polls. Have you changed your mind, and do you think it's now time to start buying diamonds?
Well, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Assalamu alaikum, and good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for having me at your conference. I suppose let me start with the trigger moment for the book, really, which might help to answer the question that you've just asked. And that was around February of last year. I'm sure, like so many of you, I was feeling a sense of hopelessness. We were 3-4 months into the war in Gaza. And it felt that everything that we had been working towards in terms of being a part of the institutions, feeling a sense of belonging in those spaces, feeling a sense of achievement, certainly amongst our generation who are now in their 50s, that whatever we did, said, asked for, nothing seemed to make a difference. And the daily maligning of Muslim communities, and indeed even those who were not Muslim, Palestinians, of whom many are not Muslim, just didn't matter. And I think it was a sense of heartbreak, a sense of frustration, a sense of anger. That meant that I felt I needed to do something. I think so many of us at that time felt that so many of you would ring me up and say, what can I do? What can I do to make a difference? And I felt at that point that if there's nothing else that I can do, I can at least document this time. That actually there has to be an accurate record of the British Muslim story. And this is such a trigger point for that. And what I felt I wanted to document was how British Muslims felt. And what was so obvious to me from the conversations I was having both with family, friends and wider, was that there was for the first time in our generation who were born and raised here, whose families, many migrated here in the 50s and 60s, who were now 4 or 5 generations into their journey in Britain, were looking for exit routes and were starting to make plan Bs. And we're having the conversations that we challenged our parents on when they would say, let's build a home somewhere in Pakistan because one day we're going to get kicked out and we're going to go and live there. And we would say, oh, don't be so crazy. Nobody's going to get kicked out and we're certainly not going back anywhere because this is now home. We're now saying, oh, let's try and find a home somewhere in the Middle East because we're going to get kicked out and we may need to go somewhere else. And I spoke to my husband at the time because many of my siblings had started to plan those exit routes. And I said, are we going to be the family that could see the writing on the wall and didn't do anything? And is it time for us to buy the diamonds? Is it time for us to sew them into our suits? Have we reached that point? And I wrote in the book that I wasn't prepared to do that. I was going to fight for my rightful place in this country, and that I needed to, in some ways, lead that fight back. And I couldn't even have predicted that here we are, nearly 12 months later, coming up to February of 2025. And it is worse than it was 12 months ago. Not only has the devastation and the destruction of genocide in Gaza been of such proportions that none of us could have envisaged that, and certainly I couldn't even have envisaged it in 2014 when I resigned on this issue. We've had the far-right racist riots across the country. We've had lynchings, the equivalent of burning people in hotels and mosques, our kind of own version of attempted pogroms against the Muslim community. But we now have the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories and narratives in a way that I have never seen before. Does that mean I've changed my mind, which is a question you asked? I'm more fearful, I'm more concerned, but I also feel that this is the moment where we need to dig deep and find the energy to fight back. Because if somebody like me, who is as part of the establishment, as you could consider to be, I'm a member of the House of Lords, I'm a Privy Councillor, I'm an ex-cabinet minister, if people so entrenched and so part of the establishment within the Muslim community start to pack their bags, then I'm afraid we've lost the battle already.
On a related point, you mentioned that you resigned from the cabinet of the government approach to go out at the time. And more recently, many shadow Labour MPs resigned from the government, such as Naz Shah and Khan. But others didn't, such as Shaban Mahmood. And I think many people here have also faced issues in their workplaces where their employers are taking a certain stance towards Gaza and not taking a certain stance, which is different maybe to the stance that they've taken on Ukraine. They've also felt ethically compromised in their roles. Do you think it's better for some of us all of us to stay with those organisations and for those MPs to stay with government and have a say? Or do you think it's more powerful for people to step down and resign? Do you think we should all be doing that? Or should we stay to try and have a voice?
So I'm going to sound like a politician now, because I'm going to say, do as I say, not as I do. For me, I think 2014 was quite a unique moment, because I always say this, had I been the Minister for Transport, I probably wouldn't have resigned. But I wasn't. I was the Minister for the Foreign Office, and I was the Minister for Human Rights, and for the ICC, and for the UN. So I was at the heart of the conversation that was happening. I was the minister that was having to sign off crazy decisions like abstaining at the United Nations Human Rights Council rather than taking a positive position. And so I wasn't just having to compromise by not taking an active role. I was compromising to the point where I was actually signing off on the most appalling of decisions. And I was also the spokesperson for Foreign Affairs in the House of Lords, so every single day I was stood at the dispatch box having to take lines, repeat lines, and say things which I fundamentally knew to be untrue. And I had to take a decision at that point, that was I prepared to create a permanent record, Hansard, in Parliament, and putting my name to it on things that, one, I did not believe in, and secondly, I knew not to be true? Or was I prepared to take a position to say not in my name? And had I been the Minister for Transport, I wouldn't have had to do that, because I wouldn't have had to stand at the dispatch box and justify it, and I wouldn't have had to sign off on submissions which fundamentally were against my values and principles. So I think that it's not as easy as saying, I don't agree with this, therefore I will resign, because compromise is a part of life, it's a part of our faith. It's, compromise was something that, the Prophet ﷺ taught us, even in the way that he dealt with matters, including political matters and matters of battle and dispute. So I spent most of my time last year, actually the year before when the war started, persuading my Labour colleagues not to resign, not to stand down. Because I said, unless you are in government, which you are not, and they were not at the time, and unless you are in a position where you are having to put your name to something and take front centre responsibility for, your resignation isn't going to make any difference. And so I would say to you that in each of your workplaces, staying the course and playing your part is far more important than that particular singular moment. I think my circumstances in 2014 were quite unique, and I therefore, I think, took issue, even with campaigns within the Muslim community who simply felt that the last election had to be about voting simply on the issue of Israel and Gaza. I think it was an important issue, but I also felt that we needed to look individually at each of the individual candidates who was standing and work out whether those people being within the system and trying to make a difference from within the system was better than those people being outside the system and outside the sphere of influence and power. And therefore, I mean, whilst I respect and completely respect and understand why people like Naz, who's a friend, and Afzal took the decisions that they took, I also completely stood by and supported people like Shabana, who I think absolutely had to do what she had to do and remain as part of the process. And when the far-right racist riots happened, I, for one, was grateful that Shabana Mahmood was Justice Secretary and dealing with the issues of these people being arrested and convicted and sentenced in the way that they were, which stemmed the violence which could have escalated. But I think those early arrests and those harsh sentences sent a very strong message that they weren't going to get away with it.
Thank you. I think many of us also, as you alluded to in your book, have worked with other Muslims in the workplace who are perhaps not as openly practicing or interested in Muslim issues. Maybe they take part in, going to the pub or social events in a way that we might not feel comfortable. How did you approach such Muslim colleagues? Did you see them as potential allies or potential threats, or neither?
Okay. So I think to be a Muslim in Britain today, you don't have to be a Muslim. Let me explain that. I'm not interested in religiosity. I'm not interested in whether you pray, you don't pray, how you pray, what you believe, what you don't believe, what you wear, what you don't wear, what you eat, what you don't eat. That's between you and your God. I'm not a theologian, and I don't feel that it's up to any of us to hold judgment on anyone else. I come from an incredibly diverse religious upbringing. My family have both Sunni and Shia heritage and roots. We were brought up in Savile Town in Dewsbury, which is the Deobandi Central. So I was brought up as part of the Tablighi Jamaat movement. We also went to every shrine that my parents ever found. And in Bahrain, we went to Ashura. And it was a big part of our life to be at the Imam Bara. So we had the most wonderful pluralistic Islamic upbringing. And I think in some ways it probably made us very, very non-judgmental, because, our parents taught us that there were many, many ways in which to find Allah, find God, and find your faith. And in my first book, I talk about that. I talk about what is Islam. And I always say to my kids that if you ever want to understand what your mum's understanding was of faith, then, for me, Islam is about me, it's not about you. It's a rule book for me, it's not a lecture series for you. It's a ruler that I have chosen to measure myself against. It's not a stick with which to beat you. It's about me, it's not about you. And I think that for me, fundamentally, is how I see faith. So for me, when I'm in public life and I come across other people who are Muslim, are practicing Muslim, are not Muslim, it's irrelevant to me. What matters to me is that you can't be selectively Muslim and you can't be conveniently Muslim. So you can't say things like, oh, let me give an example. I'm not really Muslim, I don't practice it, it wasn't a part of my life, it was something I was born into, but it's not part of my practice now. But then conveniently decide that you're going to use your Muslimness as a barrier when you talk about things like Shamima Begum, and you decide to strip her of her citizenship. And so I don't have an issue with colleagues saying, and by the way, I talk about Sajid Javid in the book, right? I consider him to be a friend, but I also consider him to be somebody who was conveniently Muslim, who talked about it not being a part of his life, not being, and that's between him and his God, what he chooses to live. But then he can't use it as a cover to say the things that he thinks he can get away with, but others would not if he wasn't called Sajid Javid. And ethnic minority politicians who pander to racism and punch down and think that that is career enhancing, which it often is for them, I'm sorry, have to be called out. But they have to be called out not because of what they might drink or what they might eat, but because they are weaponizing their Muslim identity to damage Muslim communities. And that's the challenge for me, nothing else. So I think in your workplace, I don't think that you should be interested in your colleagues' Muslim religiosity. I think what you should be interested in is whether or not, when it comes down to the issues that concern Muslims, whether they are an ally or whether they are neutral, or whether most damagingly they are people who actually are part of the problem. And for me, that third category, and I see enough of them in politics, that third category, I think, are the most concerning for me and should be the most concerning for the community.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are out of time, I'm afraid, so we'll have to leave it there.